Hello. Hello. Uh, can you guys hear me? Hello. Yeah. Okay. So, uh, hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Today we continue with, I think, biology live session 9. I am Arpit Omprakash. I am your TPM for this course, one of your PMRF TAs. So, uh, yeah. So today we'll discuss about week 9 lectures. Before we start, here are some important links. First, we have the link for the live session. Then we have the link for the YouTube channel where all the recordings of the live session are updated. And we have Google Drive link where the study materials for all these live sessions will be updated. Uh, we'll cover all these three lectures, 44, 45, 46, which dealt with ecological interactions first, and then we'll move on to two specific case study, one on pig waste mutualism and the other one on seed disposal. So before we move on to ecological interactions, we first need to understand how are things organized in ecology. Uh, so as we all know, cell is the fundamental unit of life. Uh, But if you are talking about ecology, the fundamental unit in which we are dealing, or in a broader sense, in many branches of biology, the more fundamental unit that we deal with is an individual. Right. So individual is basically one second. So individual is basically uh, an individual. How do I define? So basically uh, single organism is called an individual. For example, me or you or a single ant, a single bird is an individual, right? Then when we combine or when we talk about a group of individuals, we are then dealing with populations. So population is basically mm, a group of individuals which are restricted by geographical space and time, right? So a group of individuals that occur at a given uh, uh, area in a given period of time in as populations, right? Then we move on to uh, a group of populations which becomes a species. So basically, a species is like, uh, for example, uh, if we talk about tiger, we might have like different populations of tigers all across India. For example, we might have tigers in Madhya Pradesh, we might have population of tigers in Madhya Pradesh, we might have a population of tigers in the Western Ghats, right? But we also might have a population of tigers in eastern regions such as North. But when we combine all such populations, when we look at just tigers all across India or all across the world, then we are talking about a species, right? We are talking about the species level. Then we move on to community. So community is basically made up of all different kinds of species that are present in a given area and interact with each other, right? So a community is made up of different species that are interacting with each other. Then we move on to ecosystem, which also which consists not only of the uh, biotic part or not only of the living organisms, but also the abiotic factors such as the temperature, humidity, if you're talking about aquatic habitats, the salinity, osmolarity, and things like that. So those are those are things where we are talking about ecosystem. And you want bio, for example, if you're talking about the uh, forest biome, it means all different kinds of forests that are found all across the globe. When we are talking about desert, it means all sorts of desert ecosystems that we find all across the globe, and so on and so forth. So the study of individuals is generally termed as organismal biology or comes under the purview of organismal biology. When we are talking about populations, we deal with population ecology. Then when we move on to like communities or species, we are dealing with community ecology. And then when we are talking about ecosystems, we talk about ecosystem ecology. Right. So we are more interested today in defining what are communities and what are ecosystems. So as I said before, a community is a group of populations of different species that are living close enough to interact with each other. Right. For example, this bird and this flower may be interacting. The bird might be pollinating the flower or eating its fruit or something like that. Right. So community is a group of populations of different species that are living nearby and that interact with each other. And when we are talking about community ecology, we are basically dealing with these biotic interactions that happen organisms in a given area. The next thing we'll talk about is ecosystem. So ecosystem is a community of living organisms, including different life forms and also their interaction with the non-living or abiotic components. Right. So here, when we talk about ecosystem, we are emphasizing not only on the biotic interactions that are happening in a given area, but also the interactions between the biotic and the abiotic components that are present in that area. So how individuals and species interact in a community or ecosystem. So the most uh, the most common example for us is looking at food. So this is basically a ecological pyramid, which in a way talks about who eats who or who eats what, right? So we have at the bottom of the ecological pyramid are producers or autotrophs, which basically produce their food by using sunlight. Okay. So producers are autotrophs, which basically produce their food by using sunlight. And then we have primary consumers, which basically uh, eat producers of autotrophs, right? So everything other than these autotrophs are basically heterotrophs. So they basically eat other living organisms and they don't synthesize their own energy. So primary consumers are animals or creatures that basically producers or autotrophs. So when we talk about producers or autotrophs, we can think about things like grass or things like trees, which basically are photosynthetic, use light, synthesize takes a carbohydrate. And then when we are talking about primary consumers, we are mostly talking about organisms that are eating, for example, uh, in general herbivores, such as bison or elephant even, are basically primary consumers because they are basically eating the auto giraffes and secondary consumers, which basically feed on primary consumers. So secondary consumers so secondary consumers basically uh, feed on primary consumers, as I said before. So, for example, animals like, so if we talk about autotrophs, let's say we'll give some examples. So let's say autotroph or a producer is grass, then a primary consumer can be a grasshopper, right? Secondary consumer will be a frog, which basically eats a grasshopper. And then we'll have tertiary consumers such as snakes, which will eat the frogs. Right. So we can have many different organisms or animals at different levels of this ecological pyramid. Each level is called a trophic level. Okay. We might have known about this. We might have studied this before. Uh, So tertiary consumers are generally also or the organisms that sit on the highest trophic level are generally called as apex predators. Um, for example, things like tigers, lions are generally considered sharks are generally considered apex predators because they mostly eat everything that is present out there and nothing eats them right directly. But when these tertiary consumers, secondary consumers, primary consumers are not due to natural causes or due to other things, and they start decomposing. We have these scavengers, parasites, and decomposers, which basically degrade these animal carcasses and even like plant carcasses into, uh, yeah, they basically degrade these into their more constituent forms and basically uh, provide the nutrition back into the soil, which can then be used by autotrophs to basically get uh, compounds that they can use to synthesize food using sunlight. Right. Uh, then we'll talk about the ecological pyramid of biomass. So we can have different kinds of ecological pyramids. So one is the ecological pyramid of biomass, where basically we have producers, consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and quaternary consumers, and so on and so forth. And as we move up the trophic level, we see that there is a decrease in the biomass. Okay. Uh, and it's interesting to note that not all of these organisms eat each other as a whole. For example, an ant does not eat the whole of a plant. A bee does not eat the whole of a plant. A bee rather feeds on the nectar that is found in a plant. Uh, right. Uh, Similarly, a grasshopper might be eating grass but not trees. Butterfly also feeds on nectar, or basically the larvae of butterfly, uh, such as caterpillar, also feed on leaves. Right. So they might not be eating the whole of the plant, but they might be and even if they're eating a part of the plant, they are still primary consumers because they are not synthesizing their own energy, but they're getting it from other sources. Okay. So that's an important point to remember. The other thing is, the other important point is that as we move up, we see that the biomass starts to decrease. And by that is that if you uh, grass flowering plants, crops, and all that are present in a given area, and you collect all the primary consumers that are present in a given area, and you collect all the secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, quaternary consumers that are present in the same given area, you see that the biomass in each trophic level starts to decrease. And that is because as you move up the trophic level, you get less and less energy that can be converted into this biomass. So next we talk about the ecological pyramid of energy, which basically talks about how much energy is basically uh, flowing from one trophic level to the other. Right. Uh, so the general rule is that 10% of the energy basically passes on to the next level, next trophic level. For example, primary producers may, for example, if we say that primary producers uh, are getting 100% of energy, then primary consumers will get 10% of that energy. Secondary consumers will get 1% of that energy. Third, or tertiary consumers will get 0.1%, and so on and so forth. It decreases because uh, most of the energy is lost as heat. It's also lost because we respire, we respire, and we also have other bodily functions that we need to maintain. And also, digestion is not a very effective process as we move on to up the trophic levels. Right. The exception to this 10% rule is that uh, primary producers or plants get only 1% of the energy of the sun. So if they are getting 100% of energy, 100% of light from the sun, they are only utilizing 1% of it to convert. They're basically converting 1% of it into productivity, into basically biomass into other things, right? Or are able to utilize this 1% out of the 100% that the sun is giving, right? So we can see that 99% of the solar energy is lost by the plants, and only 1% is going for gross primary productivity. Gross primary productivity is the sum of net primary productivity plus respiration. Right. So of this 1%, 40% is utilized for net primary productivity, and the other 6% is lost by respiration. So not only for photosynthesis, most plants also similar to they became oxygen and give out carbon dioxide. Okay. So respiration is also another way in which plants use this energy. Right? And the composers or scavengers is nutrient cycling. So basically what they do is when organisms die across trophic levels, they basically decompose their carcasses, decompose their bodies, and basically recycle these nutrients back into soil where primary producers of crops can be. So energy requirement and transfer is a very crucial process for a given organism. Food chains are an integrated relationship between the body mass of an organism, between the energy requirement that they have and the metabolic rate of the digestive efficiency. So how much food they're able to convert into biomass, which is the metabolic rate of the digestive efficiency, how much energy do they need to function for their daily tasks, right? For example, you might, even for humans, you might see that generally when we eat food, we measure it in terms of calorie, right? So for most humans, the general caloric requirement or daily calorie intake that you need to have ranges from, let's say, 1000 to 1200 or 1300. But for people such as athletes or people such as swimmers, the caloric requirement or this energy requirement might be quite high because they are doing extensive physical activity, right? So the energy requirement might be different for different organisms, different species, and there may be different relationship because of the body mass that is present in different species. For example, a rat might need less food than an elephant or a human. Right? Similarly, elephant might need much more food than the human. So the question here arises is why do elephants eat a lot? And we'll basically come to it towards the end of it. We have a practice question where we'll discuss this more. So with that background, we'll move on to ecological interactions. So yeah, so with that background, we move on to ecological interactions. So there are different kinds of ecological interactions. And here we are talking mostly about binary interactions, interactions between two species or two members or two organisms. So we'll first talk about some negative interactions and then some positive interactions. So negative interactions, competition, where basically both the members of both the interacting individuals or species are basically negatively affected by it. It can be in the form where one member benefits by eating the other. So one is positively. So competition is when both of them are basically competing for the same thing. Basically, both of them want the same thing, and that same thing is in limited supply. Therefore, if one gets more, the other gets less, and if one gets more, then the other gets more, the first one gets less, and so on and so forth. So there's a negative interaction on negative effect on both of them. When we talk about predation, it's one member often killing or predating or eating up the other one as food. So it is beneficial for one member and to the other. Similarly, herbivore is a form of predation where basically we are talking about herbivores include plants. So here basically number one would be a herbivore and number two would be a plant, which is getting negatively affected because the herbivore is eating it or eating parts of it. Right. Then we have parasitism, where in one member is positively benefited, whereas the other one is negatively affected because basically this is what it is the kind of host, and basically we try to stay inside the host and basically derive the nutrients from the host while using nothing in return, or often giving them diseases or other affecting their lifestyle and other negative. The next negative interaction is something called commensalism, where one member is negatively affected, whereas the other member is not negatively or positively affected. So the zero here denotes that it's a neutral interaction for member two, and member two is not affected at all, either positively or negatively. Right. In terms of positive ecological interactions, we have mutualism, where basically both members are benefited. So generally, when we talk about lichens or symbiosis or symbionts, we're talking about mutualism, where basically we have two members which are dependent on each other for their survival, or two members killing each other by what we say, by an exchange of different kinds of things. Right? Then the next thing is facilitation. This comes more in terms of when we talk about plants. It's similar to mutualism, but that's a different meaning. Here again, both the members are positively affected. Then we have commensalism, similar to commensalism. Here, one member is positively affected, whereas the other member is not affected, either positively or negatively. So now we'll talk about some of these interactions in detail. So the first ecological interaction that we'll talk about is competition. Okay. So more specifically, we'll talk about interspecific competition, or competition that occurs when individuals of different species are competing for a resource that limits their growth, survival, or reproduction. So, for example, you might not think that a grasshopper and a bison might be competing, but in some cases they might be competing if they are feeding on the same kind of food, right? So they might be competing for the same kind of food, for the same kind of resources, and if a bison eats more, the grasshopper gets less, vice versa. So it's a negative interaction. Similarly, carnivores such as foxes or hyenas and leopards and tigers might be competing because they feed on the same kind of food, which is deer. Right. Yeah. So the key thing to note in interspecific interaction is that two different species or individuals of two different species are competing for a single resource or competing for the same resource. And that resource is limiting their growth, survival, and reproduction. So this famous scientist was in 1934 gave him this famous principle called the competitive exclusion principle, where basically he did experiments using two species of Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium quadratum. And what he found out is that if you plate them separately, so these different organisms, you can basically plate them in petri dishes. So if you plate them separately, they are both able to grow throughout the petri dish. But if you put them together, then one of them takes over, whereas the other one might be initially growing, but then starts dying up, and the other one takes up the whole petri dish. Right. So what he wanted to say is that because these two Paramecium species are utilizing the same resource or the same food source, and that food source is in limited supply, so the one that is better at utilizing it or better at eating the food outcompetes the other. So in the presence of one, the other cannot grow. So that is basically the competitive exclusion principle as defined by laws, as put forward by laws. So when we are talking about uh, resource, we also talk about something called the ecological niche. So, the ecological niche is defined as the sum of species use of the biotic and abiotic resources in its environment. Right. So this is a definition put forward by Grinnell and Ankel. And similarly, Hutchinson gave uh, similar definition, but like a more involved one, where he basically said that uh, a niche is basically an n-dimensional hypervolume where dimensions are different conditions or resources, and a species can occupy a given space in this n-dimensional hypervolume. Like, so let's not talk about n dimensions. We'll just, as an example, we'll talk about two dimensions here. Let's say we talk about sunlight and moisture. You look at this graph, you see that on the x-axis, we have moisture, which is increasing towards the right. And on the y-axis, we have sunlight, which is increasing as we go up. Right? So, for example, here it means this point basically means there's low sunlight and low moisture. This point basically means there's very high sunlight and very high moisture. Similarly, this means high moisture, low sun, and this means high sunlight, low moisture. Okay. So, according to Hutchinson, different species occupy different areas or different spaces in this two-dimensional space that we have. So, for example, species A might occupy a space here where species A likes to stay in areas that have high sunlight but low moisture. Right? So it might be, you can think of it as a desert species. Right? So it might not need a lot of water or a lot of moisture, but it needs a lot of sunlight. Right? Similarly, we have the species B, which needs high moisture and high sunlight to occur, and species C, which needs high moisture, but it can grow across a broad range of sunlight. So what you see here in this light green box is basically all the area that species can occupy. So from here to here is all the area that species C can occupy along the axis of sunlight. But due to the presence of species B, the species C is actually occupying here. Right. So we call the whole area that a species can occupy if there are no competitors as the fundamental niche. And the actual area that the species is occupying because of competition is known as realized niche, right? So fundamental niche is basically uh, all the area or in this in-dimensional hypervolume, all the space that a species can occupy. And a realized niche is basically the space that the species occupying, given that these other species are also present. What here it means better compared to species C in utilizing resources, and that's why it's species restricted to this area, right? To this area in this space. So here we look at the competitive exclusion principle again. So two species niches overlap completely, then these two species will not be able to coexist because the one species that is better at utilizing these resources or these conditions will flourish, killing off the other species, right? Or competing the other species. Again, in the example, we are showing basically um, different kinds of species and different areas that they are occupying. Some species might move across different. For example, the red dots here are segregating according to the moisture, but they need similar sunlight. The orange ones, the yellow ones, basically segregating according to sunlight, even though they require similar amounts of moisture. Similarly, the other ones here are basically segregating on both moisture and sunlight axis. Right. So two species cannot basically occupy the same space. So For example, this species is occurring here. We cannot have another species that is occurring exactly here because one of them will outcompete the other, and so one of them will die. So, talk about and then talk. So, as it's out of the scope of this course, but these two scientists, basically Lotka from James Lotka from the Shito, we gave this of equations called the Lotka-Volterite equations, which basically define competition and predator-prey dynamics in a given area. So, yeah, just know these things, but we'll not delve much into this. Um, so, to look at competition in more depth, we'll talk about the feline study. Let's present in writing by go there online and access it. So the case study is that we'll talk about like basically one question that was addressed by two different research groups, which one using two different methods. So basically the question is that what is the diet overlap of three sympatric species, tiger, leopard, and whole? So sympatric species are species that are occurring in the same geographical location, right? So what is the diet overlap of these three species? Uh, Andrei et al. In 2007 used diet analysis to basically answer this question, whereas Kafli et al. In 2019 used camera traps to answer this question. Both studies were conducted in different areas, and we'll talk about it more. So the Andheri et al. Study in 2007 was uh, carried out, headed by Professor Dr. Ullas Karan. And basically, it was carried out in Bandipur Tiger Reserve in Karnataka. And basically, they wanted to look at diet. What they did is they did scat analysis. So this is basically looking at the fecal material these organisms to study what they have eaten. Right. And this is they found out that tigers, which are generally here, is generally more than two, generally tend to eat larger prey or Indian bison, sambar deer, which are like large deers that are found in these areas, and other larger animals. Whereas leopards and wolves, which are generally less than 100 kgs, tend to eat smaller prey such as wild pigs, cheetal deer, which is the spotted deer, which is yeah, smaller size compared to sambar deer and other younger animals. Right. So the study basically concluded that niche partitioning is occurring in all three species. The first niche partitioning is occurring in prey size as a result of the body size of the prey. Which are larger and more heavier. They tend to eat larger prey, and leopards and wolves, which are smaller, tend to eat smaller prey. Therefore, there's a niche partitioning that is happening. So even though they feed on like other animals, they are not feeding on the same animals here. Therefore, they're avoiding competition. And the second point is there's a difference in the hunting patterns of leopards and wolves. So, for example, leopards follow this sneak predation strategy where they basically hide in trees or other areas and basically wait for the prey to come in and then sneakily attack them. Whereas wolves basically are endurance predators. So these are wild dogs that basically chase these animals and try to eat them. Right. So they are targeting different animals in different areas because leopards are better at sneaking up and wolves are better at uh, running after them and eating them. So there's a uh, difference in hunting pattern that is also leading to less competition between them. Right. Next, we'll talk about Kafle et al. In 2019, where they basically did the study in Chitwan National Park in Nepal. So we see the map that is shown here. So and what they did basically they laid out 2 into 2 kilometer square grids all across the national park. So they did this by using a map, right? They didn't actually go there and lay out 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer grids physically. What they did was they took a map of the region and basically laid out mm, grids on top of it, and then randomly selected a few grids where they basically can put a pair of camera traps. So camera trap is basically a device that is basically tied to a tree that generally takes photos uh, at regular intervals or when it senses movement. So they were able to basically put these camera traps in 362 locations across 17 days, different kinds of organisms, including tigers, leopards, and humans. So what they found out is that we'll not talk about all the results, but we'll talk about some of them. So what they found out is that they found that there are places in the national park where there are very high distribution of this sambar deer, and there are places where there are low distribution of sambar deer. And although there was a significant overlap in the prey of tiger and leopards were found in like areas of higher density near livestock and not near native prey. So more tigers would be found in areas which have higher abundance of sambar deer, but more leopards would be found in areas which have higher densities of livestock such as cattle and sheep, right? Because they tend to sneak up on them and eat them easily. Right? So the next interaction that we'll talk about is predation. So predation is basically an interaction between two species where basically one species, the predator, kills and eats the other, which is a prey. So, for example, lions eat zebras, cheetahs eat other animals, tigers eat other animals, and so on and so forth. So, there's basically predation. Most of us have a fair idea of this, have uh, know that like many animals such as tigers, lions eat other animals, and basically they're predators, and the animals that they're eating are prey. So this interaction is positive for the predator because it gets food and energy, whereas it's negative for the prey because either it dies or it's severely mutilated and unable to function or reproduce or survive. Right. Predation gives rise to very interesting phenomena that we see in nature. So one of them is basically um, development of these different kinds of spots in different organisms. For example, this fish has a spot on its back, which looks like an eye, so that a predator is confused where the head of the fish is, and it's unable to approach because the predator wants to approach the fish from behind so that it can easily eat it. But now it's confused where is the head of the fish because it can see eyes on both sides. So it's unable to like figure out where to approach the fish from, right? Or sometimes, so we'll talk about that in a bit. Yeah. Then we have these stick insects and other insects such as uh, false leaf katydids and all that we might have seen, which basically imitate other um, different kinds of structures and trees. For example, the false leaf katydid imitates a leaf. So it's an insect that looks like a leaf. And the stick insect, which looks like a piece of twig, and it's very difficult for people or for predators to basically figure out that this is an insect in the background of a tree or in the background of a piece of wood or leaves and so on and so forth. So it gets very difficult for them to distinguish them from the background and predate on them. Then the other interesting thing that we see is something called mimicry. So before we understand mimicry, we need to see that. So, for example, some butterflies, what they do is basically uh, many birds and many other predators basically feed on them, right? Frogs and so on and so forth. So basically, what done is basically they produce toxins or harmful chemicals that basically either give a bitter taste or basically harm the predator that eats them, right? And along with the toxins, they have different distinguishable, very distinct patterns, right? So what the predator can do is basically once it eats a butterfly that looks like this, for example, once it eats a butterfly that looks like uh, this, what it will do is it will try to avoid that butterfly in successive encounters because it knows that it tastes better or it like causes some issue for the predator or it will imitate these patterns or they try to mimic these patterns that are found in this window. Once it eats butterfly, it will recognize this pattern. It will try to see, okay, this pattern is means that this butterfly is not tasty. This butterfly is very bitter. I don't want to eat it. Right. So if it encounters this pattern, it will not eat it. And the other butterflies, which are basically imitating this pattern, so the bird will try to avoid these butterflies also. So even though the mimics don't produce any toxins, what they are doing is basically they are basically utilizing the toxin producing butter design of the toxin, and they have evolved very similar butterflies. And basically, the predator then learns to and what zebras have those stripes. In moving in a group, it's very difficult for the predator to identify or run after a single zebra because in moving in such a large group, it's very difficult for them to focus on a single prey, and the predator gets confused, right, because of the stripe patterns that they have. Then other organisms such as porcupines have these defensive mechanisms such as the quills, which basically deter predators from eating them. Then we have other insects such as these moths, which have these big, flashy, eye-like patterns on their wings, which basically, uh, so the predator feels like, okay, someone is watching me. I can't go and eat them. Like it might run away or something. And similarly, this is another thing called aposematism, where basically these frogs generally are very poisonous and they have these very bright coloration. So, as with the butterflies, these bright colorations make them very distinct from the other prey that are found in the given area. And thus, what do you say? Um, Predators slowly learn to avoid these kinds of frogs with very bright colors and beautiful, even beautiful, but like very bright and shiny patterns, right? Because they are generally very toxic or poisonous. Okay, so we move on to the next ecological interaction, which is herbivory. Okay. So herbivory is interaction in which an organism eats. So it's similar to predation. It's basically predation on plants, right? So it's an interaction in which an organism eats part of a plant than another. So, for example, we have these wildebeest, we have these monkeys, we have or baboons, we have these giraffes and zebras, which basically feed on different uh, mm, plants or different parts of the plant. Right. So this negative interaction is most commonly not fatal because they are not eating the whole plant, but they basically eat different parts of the plant. For example, they might just eat leaves, they might just eat fruit, they might just eat a few branches and not the whole plant. Right. But This predation on plants significantly reduces their growth and reproductive fitness, and in extreme cases, it can be detrimental to them. Right. So there are different types of herbivores that are found. So we might have grazers, which basically uh, graze on grass and herbs which are very close to the ground or the substrate. Right. Then we have browsers, which basically uh, lightly shrubs or herbs. So they are still closer to the ground, but not on the ground, not eating off the ground exactly. We have frugivores, which basically eat fruits, often without damaging the seeds. So they'll basically eat the fruits and throw away the seeds or throw away half-eaten fruits or basically swallow the seeds and basically poop it out, right? Then we have granivores, which basically predate on the seed specifically, right, not the fruit. We have folivores, which basically feed mostly on the leaves. For example, some monkeys feed mostly on leaves. Then we have xylophages, which basically eat mostly wood or like dead parts of the plant, right? Hardened parts of the plant. So the next question that arises is how do plants cope up with herbivory? So ma'am talked about the cafeteria example where she asked you to close your eyes and basically imagine that you're in the cafeteria and you're basically reading and eating, and then a group of people come in and they basically start playing music or start creating noise. And what would you do? So generally, we as humans have three different kinds of strategies. The first thing is like you might turn on your own headphones and sit and work. So this strategy is also called as tolerance. So you're basically tolerating them, right? The second thing might be you are getting up from that area and finding another place to eat and study. So this is called avoidance. You are avoiding the people who are creating an issue. And then the third thing is you are confronting them or putting up a fight or arguing with them. So the third thing is resistance. So these three kind of strategies also plants are following when they're dealing with herbivory. Right. So tolerance is basically where uh, plant rates basically, even though there are herbivores which are eating them, what the plant is doing, it's trying to tolerate the herbivores, and basically it's trying not to move away or avoid them. It's trying not to resist or what do you say, affect the herbivore in any way. Rather, it's trying to tolerate it and like via its own mechanisms, it's trying to basically um, what do you say, tolerate the herbivores and not let them affect it. Right. So, for example, we might have uh, we might do an experiment where basically we have these two different plants of the same species. So C is basically controlled, D is basically defoliated. So defoliated means the leaves are cut down. So follicles, leaves were basically cut down. So let's say in the beginning, they were of the same height. Then we basically cut the leaves of this D plant, and the C plant is a control. We are not touching the control. So what can happen is it can either compensate for the loss. So let's say at some other time point, the control plant has grown by this much. The defoliated plant will also try and grow by this much. It can also overcompensate. So what it means is that the uh, defoliated plant tries to grow more or faster than the control plant because it is getting fed on, right? And it can also undercompensate. So basically, it's not growing that much. It's growing slower than the control plant, right? So one potential mechanism of tolerance is this overcompensation or the faster regrowth of tissues. Because if the plant feels, or not exactly feel, so it's anthropomorphizing the plant, but basically if the uh, parts of the plants are getting destroyed, it's trying to basically uh, grow them faster so that they are basically, even if it's eaten or even if later it's eaten, it's not damaging what do you say? It will still be, so even if we cut this much amount of it, it will still be right, overcompensating for this loss. So the next strategy is avoidance, where basically plants develop traits that decrease the probability of them being eaten and other predation events or herbivore events. So avoidance can be in terms of physical avoidance. So for example, plants that are grazed down can start to become develop a prostrate habit. So what this means is the plant, instead of growing vertically, it will start growing on the ground so that it's difficult for the browsers or others to basically eat the plant, and it's basically growing along the substrate. Right? So that's called a prostrate habit. Then the plant might start to have storage underground. So it might develop things like what do you say, underground fruit or tuber and so on and so forth. So basically, it's storing much of its energy under the ground or much of its biomass under the ground so that it's not available to be eaten by these herbivores, right? Etc. So these are physical avoidance mechanisms that uh, can basically be adopted by plant in response to herbivory. The other thing is life history traits or life history changes. So basically, the plant might avoid to grow during the grazing season and it might start growing after the grazing season is over, so that it's avoiding any overlap with the grazers and it's basically avoiding getting eaten by the grazer. The third way in which plants deal with herbivores is the resistance. So any plant traits that reduce the amount of damage created by herbivores are said to give them resistance. So things such as spines, thorns, and having a strong bark are basically physical mechanisms that give them resistance against browsers and grazers and browsers. Right. Uh, but the other kind of chemical defenses that also plants can, what do you say, develop, such as plants can basically generate what are called the secondary metabolites, which are basically alkaloids, phenolics, and other compounds that are basically harmful or detrimental to the animals. But many of the alkaloids and other secondary metabolites that plants are producing are generally useful to us. So things like morphine, caffeine, and nicotine are things that generally we harvest from plants, but they are generally synthesized by plants to avoid uh, herbivores or to damage herbivores. Right. Just the grazing behavior. So the next ecological interaction we'll talk about is parasitism. So parasitism is a symbiotic interaction in which one organism, which is called the parasite, derives its nourishment from another organism, which is called the host, which is harmed and sometimes killed in the process. So the parasite gets positively benefited, whereas the host gets negatively affected. And it's called a symbiotic relationship because it occurs because both the life forms occur in very close proximity, right? That's why it's called symbiotic. So there are two broad types of parasite based on where they occur. We might have ectoparasites, which are like ticks, mites, etc., leeches and all, which basically stick to the outside of the body and basically draw nourishment from the host outside the body of the host. And we have endoparasites, such as malaria parasite, which is Plasmodium, and wasps that lay eggs on their host. So we'll talk about these wasps in not exactly this wasp, but like, yeah, we'll talk about some parasitic wasps in some time when we deal with the next lecture. So basically, endoparasites stay within the body of the host and derive nourishment inside the body of the host. Right. So there can be different kinds of parasites. So, for example, we might have viruses, bacteria, insects, protozoans, fungi, and helminths that basically occur inside or outside the body of organism, which is generally the host, and derives their nourishment from them. Right. The next ecological interaction that we are dealing with is mutualism. So, mutualism or mutualistic symbiosis is an interspecific interaction that benefits both the species. Right. So, basically, for example, we talk about lichens. It's the mutualistic association between algae and the fungi, where basically uh, mm, is providing food, one of them is providing shelter and raw materials for the food. Right. So it's specific because it's occurring in very close proximity. So both the species are occurring in very close proximity. That's why it's called symbiosis. Right. So mutualists can be of different types. It- Right. For example, seed dispersers are mutualists because they basically eat the fruit and disperse the seed. For example, frugivorous birds and monkeys. So they basically get the fruit from the animal, the tree, and basically they disperse the seed of the tree, which helps the tree reproduce. Right. They can be obligate, where basically both of them need to support each other, otherwise they will die. Right. For example, plant pollinator systems, because pollinators derive their nutrition from the plants, whereas plants are able to reproduce because of the presence of these pollinators. Right. They can be facultative, where they don't need to be mutualistic all the time, but they can be mutualistic from time to time. And a kind of mutualism that occurs, which is called defensive uh, mutualism, where basically the aphids produce seed kind of uh, substance, which they basically feed to ants, give to ants, and in return, the ant colony of the ants basically provide uh, uh, defense to the aphids against other predators that are trying to feed on the aphids. Correct. Mutual can also be example of mutualism can plant mycorrhizal. We have these mycorrhizae or nitrogen fixing bacteria or near the roots of the plants. They help and so that it's take the whereas the plant basically supply uh, mycorrhizal mycorrhizal. Next, we'll talk about commensalism and amensalism. Uh, so commensalism is an interspecific interaction that benefits one species while the other species is unharmed. For example, we have this remora fish and gates. So the remora fish has this kind of, you know, look at it here. It has this kind of, what do you say, sucking mouth, which basically it can basically, so it's not eating the shark, it's not eating the whale, but it's basically, uh, what do you say, fixing itself onto the whale so that wherever the whale is, it can move along with it. Right. So it's basically using the whale as a vehicle and hitchhiking with it to a different place. Right. So swimming inside water is a very costly affair, and this is a way in which these remora fish are avoiding expending that energy while moving to a different place using whales as their vehicles. Right. Similarly, barnacles that are present on whales also use the whales to move from one place to the other, and they don't the language, but they are basically getting positive space and food resources from the language. The next interaction that we'll talk about is or it is the interspecific interaction. The one species is found that the other is neither benefited nor harmed. Right. For example, penicillin that is produced by some fungi, bacteria, and other allelopathic chemicals that are produced by plants and all, basically prevent the growth of other plants that are nearby to it. Right. So, so this kind of reduction is termed as penicillin. Basically, the fungi that is producing penicillin to kill the bacteria around it is not exactly uh, gaining or losing anything from it, but the bacteria that are affected are basically. So people are also kind of like um, nowadays people are also thinking that this might be some form of competition where the fungi is trying to deter the bacteria from growing because it's a competitive species. But like for the purpose of the course, we term this interactions as amencilism. So that was it for lecture 44, 45, and 46. So we talked about a lot of different ecological interactions. Next, we'll talk about, we'll look at case studies and we'll talk about specific things such as mutualism. And the next lecture, we'll talk about seed dispersal. Right. So, does anyone have any questions or doubts? So we'll move on with lecture 47, which is the case study on mutualism. So basically here we talk about figs. So figs are also called as the queen of trees. And in this lecture, we looked at fig and fig wasp interactions as a case study of for mutualism. Right. So the learning objective is to learn about different kinds of fig trees that are present around us. Why are fig trees important? Why are fig trees important? And we'll talk about fig and fig wasp interaction. Right. So fig trees basically belong to the genus Ficus. So we have this banyan tree here, we have this peepal tree here, and we have this other fig tree here, which basically all belong to the same genus, which is Ficus, and therefore they are known as uh, the fig trees, right? Uh, we can have another different kind of fig tree. For example, this is called a strangler fig. So this is from an old abandoned temple or something. So basically, we have this fig tree, ficus tree, which is growing on top of another tree, and slowly, slowly, it will start to strangle and kill that tree. So that's why it's called a strangler fig. Okay. So why are we talking about fig trees? Why are fig species or fig trees so important for us? So figs are what are called keystone species. So what this means is basically they have a very disproportionate effect on the ecosystem or on the area in which they are present. Right. So they can change, modify, or affect that area to quite a large extent. Right. There's a very high diversity of ficus trees around us. Right. We'll talk about fig versus mutualism, which is example of a great mutualism. And because they're keystone species because they basically support multiple interactions between many different species. There are also cultural influences which make it very important for us to study those. Before we move on to fig trees, we need to talk about a bit about flowers and flora and term. So you don't need to learn about all of these things. You can take a look at it later when I share the slides. Basically, or you can go through my lectures also. So basically, flowers generally have a male and a female part, right? So the male part is generally called the stamen, which has the anther on the top, which contains these pollens, which are the male reproductive gametes, right? So this is the male reproductive part of the flower. Then the flower also has this female reproductive part, which is called the pistil, right? and it has basically a ovary which contains this female gametes called ovules, and then the ovary is basically uh, connected to the stigma, which is basically where the pollen really falls, and connected to it by a style, by something called a style. Right. So based on the way that flowers are arranged in a given, so if you find many different kinds of flowers in a given uh, tree, that in a given plant, in a given branch, in a given area, it's called basically an inflorescence. And based on how these flowers are arranged, these inflorescence have basically different kinds of names. So here are a few types of inflorescence. So no need to remember all these names, but like just look at the patterns that they're kind of forming, and that's why they are named like this. Right. So we have raceme, we have spike, we have spadix, catkin, racemose, corym, and amber. Right. So another thing is flowers can be of many different kinds. So we might have hermaphrodite flowers, which have both the stamen and the pistil, so which have both the male and the female reproductive parts. We can these are basically hermaphrodite flowers, right? Some plants also have, so for example, monoecious plants will have flowers which have only the male part and other flowers which have only the female part. Right. Flowers which have only the male part and other flowers which have only the female part. So these are called monoecious plants. And again, we also have something called dioecious plants, which have uh, male parts or male flowers in one plant and female parts or female flowers in another plant. Right. So when we talk about the fig plant, we are talking about a single person. So what is happening is basically we have a very fleshy receptacle which with many male and female flowers that are present inside, and it generally has a ostiole or a hole through which basically these fig wasps can enter. Right. So here you see the diagram of this. Basically, you have immature synconium, right, which is a fleshy receptacle. And on the bottom end, on the apical end, you have this hole called the ostiole through which fig wasps can enter, and they have these different kinds of flowers that are present inside, right? So these different kinds of flowers, so it can have male flowers, which are denoted by this. It can have these long style flowers, which have this long style, and the ovary is present below. And we also have this gall flower, which basically has a very short style. It's also called as a gall flower or a short style flower, right? So basically, this is the same thing. So the life cycle of fig and fig was is something that we'll discuss now. So basically, we'll start here. So a female fig wasp, which has pollen that is laden on it, basically enters the synconium. So it goes inside and it basically lays eggs in some of the flowers and pollinates the other, and it dies inside. Right. So we talked about these two different kinds of flowers that we have. So the long style flower and the gall flower. So the fig wasp basically has something called the ovipositor, which is present here. And basically what it does is it tries to pierce the ovipositor inside the flower and try to lay eggs inside the ovary. Right. Since some of the flowers have very large long style. So the fig wasp is not able to penetrate fully into the ovary. So it just pollinates these long style flowers. And because we have other flowers which have these the gall flowers, which basically have this short style. So what this fig wasp does is basically it uh, can lay eggs inside this gall flower, right? So the wasp lays eggs in some flowers, which are basically the gall flowers, and then pollinates the others, which are basically the long style flowers, right? So the fig seeds and galls harbor basically develop. So we have the long style flowers develop into the fig seeds, whereas the gall flowers harbor the wasp larvae, which are developing. Right. Then what happens is basically the males and the females will come out, the male and female wasps. So the male wasps basically will fertilize the females and then dig a tunnel through the synconium. Right. They'll dig a tunnel through the synconium and then die. Right. And that's why they don't have these like long antennae or wings or other developed parts. They basically are born and die inside the synconium uh, after they fertilize the females and dig the tunnel. They die there. Right. These female figures basically when they are in, they burst out, basically they are fertilized by the males and then they fly out from here and then go again and go inside another fig synconium and try to lay their eggs. Right. So what we talked about here is the first case where we talked about the monoecious uh, case where basically the uh, fig synconium has both male and female flowers and both long style and short style flowers. Right. So therefore, it basically can give rise to a lot of wasps, a lot of different kinds of. It can give rise to basically these wasp larvae, and also it can give rise to seeds. Now, in the case of dioecious plants, as we talked about, so what happens is dioecious plants have so dioecious plants can be of two types. One is basically a hermaphrodite plant, where basically it has uh, male reproductive parts and it has female reproductive parts, both within the same synconium. So what is happening here is basically uh, this hermaphrodite plant will have all the flowers, which will be gall flowers. Right. So what will happen is the fig will come inside, they'll take these pollens from the males and basically fertilize all these flowers. Not fertilize some of them and basically lay eggs in most of them. And most of them will grow on to be wasp eggs. Right. And give rise to wasps. Now these wasps will fly out and basically go into this other dioecious flowers, which basically only have the long styled or mostly have the long styled female flowers. Right. So what will happen here is most of these or almost all of these female flowers will basically none of them or almost none of them will develop into the wasp. Right. So you might the wasp inside a fig which has only female flowers because it cannot lay eggs there, right? So what is happening here is basically the, among other things, the dioecious flowers basically have kind of dioecious synconium basically have similar kinds of volatile compounds or basically chemical compounds which basically make them uh, smell and feel like they are these kinds of hermaphrodite or monoecious flowers, right? And therefore, the fig was the females go inside and fertilize and basically uh, pollinate all of these female flowers. Right. So here's a table summarizing all of it. So we have monoecious figs, synconiums, which basically have both the male and female flowers in the same synconium. So the male and female flowers are dispersed throughout the synconium, and both the long style and short style female flowers are present there, and it produces both seeds as well as fig wasp larvae. Then we have this dioecious hermaphrodite synconiums, which have male and female flowers both in the same synconium. The male flowers are generally present near the ostiole, the hole where the uh, wasp is entering this place, the ostiole. Right. And the female flowers are generally concentrated at the base on the opposite side. So female flowers are generally found on the opposite side. And it generally has these gall flowers or short style female flowers and produces mostly wasps and very few seeds. Then we have the dioecious female flower synconium, which has only female flowers, only long style female flowers, and basically it produces only seeds and a few wasps. Right. Now comes the other interesting part. So basically, we have this here you can see actually a fig wasp, and basically it's uh, ovipositor, which it basically puts into the uh, stigma to lay eggs. Now we have these. So basically, these pollinators go inside the fig synconium and basically pollinate it from the inside. But we have these what are called parasitoid wasps, which basically have a very long ovipositor, as you can see here. And what they will do is from the outside of the fig, basically, they'll put it, they'll put their ovipositor inside and try to fertilize these, try to basically lay eggs in these uh, fig synconium. Right. So these are basically parasitoids, or these are basically parasites of the figs. So basically, they are coming and basically without providing any pollinator services, they are negatively affecting the fig plant by basically laying their eggs and basically destroying these flowers or preventing them from basically growing. Right. So this is from the paper that we talked about a while back. I think somewhere around lecture live session 2 or 3, where basically we talked about that research carried out in Renevoides lab. This paper is this photo is from an annotated paper that is present on the I think biology course website. I suggest you go out there and check it out. So basically, these are showing scanning electron microscope images of different ovipositors that are found, and it shows basically that parasitoid wasps and different kinds of parasitoid wasps and different kinds of fig wasps have different, slightly different structures based on which species of fig they are targeting and basically what kind of fig synconium they are targeting. Like some of them might need to drill, some of them are like more easier to get in, and so on and so forth. Now we'll talk about an important part, which is basically the fig synconium microcosm. So, as we talked about, we have the male and female fig synconia, right? Frugivores and seed dispersers, such as many birds and monkeys, feed on this synconia, right? And then disperse the food and disperse the seeds. The synconia are used by pollinator wasps, which basically uh, what do you say? Pollinate this, and we talked about the fig wasps. They basically pollinate this synconia and also lay their eggs in that. Right. Then we have predators of these pollinator wasps, such as ants, spiders, and dragonflies, which are basically waiting for these pollinator wasps to come in, come out of these fig synconium after growing. And basically then they'll basically predate on these pollinator wasps. Then we have these non-pollinator fig wasps, which are basically gallers or these parasitoids, which don't provide any pollinator services but only lay their eggs. So these are also eaten up by these predators, and we have also some nematodes. So nematodes are basically these uh, worms that are present. Right. So this mind map basically there are a lot of different organisms, a lot of different kinds of species that are supported by these male and female synconium of pigs. Right? And pigs are termed as a keystone species because basically around 1,000 bird species and around 300 mammal species around the world, including things such as Indian giant squirrel, the lion-tailed macaque, the fig wasp, and the great hornbill, basically feed on these figs. And basically, they basically flower asynchronously. So one individual, so not all of them flower or give rise to fruit at the same time. So throughout the year, there's a supply of food that is provided by these fig trees that can be eaten by all these kinds of different animals. And basically, there's also one of the reasons why it is termed as a keystone species. Okay. So in summary, ficus trees are considered as a keystone species because of their disproportionate effect on the ecosystem. The synconium is an inflorescence found specifically in the figs. Each ficus species has its own specific pollinator wasp, and both fig and fig wasp life cycles are very closely intertwined. Right. The fig synconium can be considered as a microcosm because close to 1,000 birds and 300 mammal species feed on these figs. So that was it for lecture 47. Next, we'll talk about lecture 48, which is seed dispersal, a case study. So these are basically images of different kinds of seeds that are found in different areas, in different regions from different plants. So the learning objective of this case study is to understand what is seed. We talk about various seed shape and sizes and how they're shaped by natural selection for their dispersal. Then we'll talk about the Janzel-Cornell hypothesis, and we'll talk about a specific study where scientists try to figure out if pig eaters are effective seed dispersers, and basically how the scientific study about seed dispersal was carried out. So seeds are embryos of plant with uh, nutrition and an outer covering, right? So seed often has a lot of nutrients, fats and microfibers, fats, fibers, and proteins that are present, around 150 calories per ounce, right, in many kinds of seeds. Angiosperms and gymnosperms are plants that different kinds of plants that produce seeds, and the earliest seeds could date back to around 420 to 350 million years ago, produced by gymnosperms. Ferns, mosses, and liverworts do not generally have seeds. They use water as a means to propagate themselves. So the images that that are shown here are basically first we are seeing ferns here on the left hand side. Then we have mosses that grow on walls, and then we have liverworts. Right. So seeds come in all different kinds of shapes and sizes. For example, we have this mustard seed, which are very small, which are generally eaten by us. Then we have these cocodemia seed, which are found in these plants, which can weigh up to 25 kilograms. So it's quite a heavy seed, right? Quite a big and heavy seed. Seeds are dispersed to different areas, to different locales by different kinds of agents. Seeds can be dispersed by wind. For example, we have these kinds of seeds. mm, Yeah, these kinds of seeds, such as dandelions and stuff, which have basically these wing kind of structures which help them fly. We have seeds of coconut, which basically float in water. So coconuts are generally found in natively found in like coastal regions and islands and all, and basically water helps them disperse into longer distances. Then these seeds can also be mm, transported for by using animals. So, for example, many seeds and basically stick to are very sticky, have very sharp edges, which can stick to different animal fur and basically get transported from one area to the other. So the question that arises is, where should seeds disperse so that most of them germinate? Should they disperse close to the parent tree or away from the parent tree? To answer that question, Jansen and Cornell put forward a hypothesis. Basically, uh, what we see here is on the x-axis, we see what is the distance from the parent tree. For example, here is the parent tree, and here is how the distance is increasing from the parent tree. Right. On one side, on this graph, we see what is the number of seeds per unit area. So most seeds are dispersed closer to the parent tree, and many of them are dispersed slightly far away. Right. And on the other hand, on the other side, we see what is the probability that seeds of seedlings or seedlings will basically multiply and become plants. So this is basically a success rate of the seed or the germination rate of the seed. So what Jansen and Connell hypothesis says is that the probability of seed dispersal decreases as distance from the parent plant increases, but the probability of seed germination and basically maturation increases as it goes away from the parent tree. Right. So there's this sweet spot where basically the seeds are slightly far away and they are able to survive and mature. So this part in the middle where basically these two graphs are intersecting is called the seedling survival sweet spot, according to Gentle and Fun hypothesis. So the question that we basically try to address here is using we are basically following this research carried out by Asmita Sen Gupta from A3 in Bangalore, which is the research institute in Bangalore. So basically, research monkeys, they looked at research monkeys and they eat lots of fruits, including fig fruits. So Asmita et al. Looked at seed dispersal by these monkeys in Baksa Tiger Reserve in West Bengal. Right. So the question that we are interested in that they ask, so they ask many different questions. So the question that we are interested in is, are fig eaters effective seed dispersers? Right. So the animals which eat figs, are they effective in dispersing the seed of the fig tree? So researchers were interested in knowing many different kinds of things, how many plant species are dispersed by macaques, how are the seeds handled, uh, handled as in like, are they eaten by them? Do they eat the seed? Do they throw away the seed? What do they do? How far from the parent tree are the seeds deposited? And what is the effect of the seed handling on germination? Right. So the first question that arises is, how do they find out how to find out if macaques are good seed dispersers? How do we study macaques? So basically, what they did is basically they did scan sampling of monkeys in the field. So basically, this is a representation. That's why it's showing something like this. So basically, generally monkeys are found higher up in the canopies, and basically there is a individual which is basically scanning for each monkey and looking at them and figuring out basically what they are doing at a given instant of time. Right? Are they eating a fruit? Are they doing something else? What kind of behavior they are exhibiting? Right. So scan sampling requires observing monkeys closely. Would the researchers present alter the behavior of the monkey? So that's also another thing to keep in mind when we are doing behavioral studies or like samplings like this, where we are basically getting close to some animal to observe them or look at them, look at what they're doing. Right. So it's very important to establish that our presence is not affecting the behavior of the animal. Right. Is the monkey not eating a lot of food because we are there? Is the monkey doing something else because we are there, and so on and so forth? So these are the kinds of things that need to be tested before drawing other kinds of conclusions from our observations. Right. So the researchers, Sengupta et al., basically found that monkeys ate fruit from around 80 plants, and the monkeys ate fruits from 3 fig species, and they swallowed their seeds. Right. So what happens is basically they'll eat the fruit and they'll basically swallow the seed and they'll basically poop it out. So the seed passes through the gut of the monkey and goes out, and they deposit it somewhere else. So on an average, some monkey disperse seeds more than 70 meters, and the dispersed fig seeds germinated faster, and more seeds germinated than the control seeds. So the control seeds that we are talking about here are basically seeds that are what do you say? Not dispersed by these monkey seeds that generally fall from the fig tree, right? Or fruits that generally fall from the fig tree. Mm. So this again is from another neurological study where they basically show what happens to seeds when they pass through a monkey's gut, right? So we'll focus on so they tested on different kinds of monkeys. They tested on folivore, frugivore monkeys, which basically eat the leaves and the fruit. They tested on frugivore monkeys, which exclusively feed on the fruit, and insectivore frugivore monkeys, which eat insects and both the fruits. So we'll basically look at frugivore monkeys here. So on the x-axis, we see that what is the proportional change from control. On the y-axis, we have two different things, what is the germination percentage and what is the germination time. So we look at germination percentage. So we see that we're looking at the frugivore monkeys only. So here we see that the graph shows something like this here. So we see that there's a proportional change from control in the positive direction, right? So this dot here in the middle is a mean or the median, and this is basically the uh, standard deviation or the variation around it, right? 71 is basically how many observations they have of this, right? Or how many seeds they collected or how many seedlings they tested. Similarly, 60, 52 all denote the number of observations that they have. So we see here basically that germination percentage is significantly higher when frugivore monkeys basically disperse the seed, or when the seeds are basically passing through the guts of a frugivorous monkey, right? Similarly, for germination time, they found out that it's proportionally less. So the seed is less compared to the control. So the seed germination time is less compared to the control. Seeds are germinating faster compared to the control. Right. So these are the two things they figured out. And this photo here is with monkey. So yeah. So the next thing that we look about is basically what is the pattern of seed dispersal if seeds are dispersed by wind. So generally, if seeds are dispersed by winds, we have these A, B, C, D different trees. We see that this is how the seeds will be dispersed. So the small letters signify the seeds, and the capital letters basically signify the trees. So the trees will be clustered. So the seeds will be clustered around the tree. All right. Now, if birds disperse the seed, what kind of pattern do you expect? So if birds are dispersing the seed, then basically it might be clustered somewhere else. So a bird might basically eat a fruit here and basically go into this other tree and basically drop the seed there, or it might swallow the seed and basically poop it out somewhere on the way or somewhere on another tree. Right. So it might be clustered around different kinds of areas, not on the same area necessarily. Now, the other important thing is we'll talk about habitat fragmentation in dispersal and conservation. We'll briefly talk about it. So, what is happening nowadays is basically we have these uh, different green patches, especially in urban ecosystems, where basically we might have green patches followed by things like houses or different kinds of buildings, right? Or roads and so on and so forth, which are basically fragmenting the habitat and basically uh, providing barriers to seed dispersal and to animal movement. So now let's say you have a green patch here. For example, it might be a forest patch here. This might be another small forest patch or a park here, and this might be another forest patch, right? So now let's say there are three trees here. One is dispersed by a bird, one is dispersed by a monkey, and one is dispersed by the wind. Now, how do you expect these kinds of plants to be dispersed across this whole area? And will it be the same if the urban regions were not present and if the whole area was basically a large forest, right? So one can easily think and argue and understand that basically uh, trees, what do you say, uh, trees that are dispersed, seeds that are dispersed by the wind might not go around that far. And even like monkeys might not be very, what do you say, uh, monkeys might not be very easily able to move from one patch to the other, whereas birds might be able to fly from one patch to the other. So this might lead to very differential dispersal of seeds and different kinds of growth patterns that we observe in these habitat fragmented areas. And basically, this gives rise to a lot of conservation concerns because now one species might not be able to move beyond the patch in which they are present. And if in future this patch is cut down or there's like a loss of forest in this part, then we might lose a species, right? So in summary, what all we talked about in this lecture is seeds and fruits come in different shapes and sizes. These traits, the traits which basically are shaped by natural selection for specific dispersal mechanisms, for example, winds, birds, or monkeys and other animals. Wind dispersal results in more seeds getting clumped near the parent tree. Animal dispersal results in clump distribution away from the parent tree. And fragmented habitats generally hinder the movement of animal and thus hinder the dispersal. Okay. So if anyone has any doubts, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, we'll move on to the practice assignment number 9. Okay. So the first question is, what is the difference between community and ecosystem? So a community ecosystem in terms to describe the same concept. B, different species living in uh, and interacting in the same location is a community. Ecosystems encompass communities along with abiotic factors in a defined area. C, community consists of only one species, while ecosystems involve interactions among multiple species. D, communities are only found in terrestrial environments and ecosystems exist in aquatic environments only. So the answer here will be B because that provides us both the definitions. So a community is different species that are living and interacting in the same location, whereas the ecosystem also encompasses the abiotic factors that are present in the defined area. Second question is, what is the primary function of a biological pyramid? A, to illustrate the population sizes of organism. B, to showcase the geographical distribution of species. C, to demonstrate the flow of energy through trophic levels. And D, to display the evolutionary relationships between organisms. So the answer here will be C, to demonstrate the flow of energy to different trophic levels, because that is what the biological pyramid does. We talked about the pyramid of energy, we talked about the pyramid of biomass, and this is what basically they show. So the flow of energy and biomass and things across trophic levels. Third question is one thing that we talked about while that we asked during one of the lectures: why do elephants eat a lot? A, they are big, they need a lot of food. B, plant material they eat is not very nutritious and they need to eat a lot. C, they have poor digestion, so they need to eat more. D, the answer lies in the energy efficiency of the ecological food chain. E, all of the above. So the answer here will be E, all of the above. So the elephant needs a lot of food because it is quite big. So according to the biomass that you have, you need energy to basically, you need food to provide energy for all the different cells and all the biomass that you have, right? The plant material that they're eating is not very nutritious and they need to eat a lot, right? That is also another thing. And then the third thing is they have poor digestion, so they need to eat more. So digestion produces a lot of waste. It also takes up a lot of energy, and that's why basically they need to eat a lot more food. And the next thing is the answer lies in the energy efficiency of the food chain. We talked about the 10% rule, and because of that, that is also another factor that adds into how much food an elephant is eating. Right. Question number 4, facilitation is where both species are benefited. Okay. B, one species is benefited more than the other. C, one species facilitates the growth and reproduction of other. D, both species are harmed. So if we go back and look at the ecological interactions table, you will see that facilitation is kind of a mutualism, where basically both the organisms are facilitating the growth of each other. So both species are being benefited. Right. Question number 5. If niches of two species completely overlap with each other, they A cannot coexist together, B can coexist together, C one outcompetes the other, and D none of the above. So the answer here will be two options. A cannot coexist together, and the reason will be because one of them outcompetes the other. Since they have the same niche or their niche is completely overlapping, what will happen is one of them, which is the better competitor, will eventually outcompete the other. Okay. Between leopard and bull can happen in Bandipur National Park because A, it was easier to observe these animals in an open park. B, both animals have different hunting strategies. One sneaks in and catches their prey, and the other tires out their prey. C, leopard and bull share their prey. and D, none of the above. So we talked about this before in Bandipur National Park when we are talking about Andheri Atoll study in 2007. What they found out is basically leopards and wolves both have different hunting strategies. One of them, which is leopard, sneaks out and catches their prey, whereas the dhole chases after it and basically tires their prey out. They also looked at tigers and they found out that tigers eat different kinds of prey. So tigers eat larger prey, whereas leopards and dhole, due to their smaller size, generally eat smaller prey. Okay, so does anyone have any questions? I wait here for 2, 3 more minutes. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. Great. Since no one has any question, we'll stop here today and I'll meet you guys in next class. Uh, Thanks.